Okay. Welcome back to the Virtual Residency Workshop 2023. It's Wednesday, June 28th. And our first talk this morning is the Cyber Ambassadors talk, Let's Talk, Communicating That There's a Problem, with Dirk Colbry of Michigan State University and Jason Sims of Swarthmore College. Dirk, take it away.
I'm just here to say, Jason, take it away.
Well, good morning, everybody, and hello, Henry. It's good to see you again. Let me get my double monitors here fired up and situated. All right. Size this. I think that should be good. Okay, now let me share my screen. All right, so I'm assuming everybody can see that. All right. Well, good morning. So yes, Henry, in case you didn't know, hit record. All right, so as was mentioned, this is the Let's Talk, Communicating a Problem curriculum. Now, this curriculum emerged out of the Cyber Ambassadors program, which I think in turn emerged from working with folks in the virtual residency and similar programs, and it's certainly grown from there. It has developed also into working with Engineering Futures and Tau Beta Pi and all this other kind of stuff, but it's a very robust curriculum that includes a lot of facets for how we can improve our professional skills when working with not only researchers, but colleagues and lay people and everyone in between. So today we're going to talk about how communication works. My name is Jason Sims. I'm the Research Computing Manager at Swarthmore College. So I do this kind of thing all the time. I'm sure many of us do. That is why we're here. And so this is something that's near and dear to me by professional training. I'm actually not a technical person, as odd as it seems. I'm actually a cultural anthropologist. So, communicating and understanding how cultural groups interact and kind of work together is sort of part and parcel with what I've done with my career. So I'm very happy to be presenting on this topic. We must acknowledge all of the work that has gone into developing this curriculum. Suffice to say, I'm not going to read this slide, but it is just safe to say that a whole bunch of people, including the National Science Foundation and a lot of other individuals and organizations, have contributed to making this curriculum what it is and contributing to its success. So a couple of times during this presentation, both sort of formally as well as a little bit informally, we're going to do what's called chatters. So chatters are where I might pose a question to you, and you think about it for a few seconds, and you type your answer into the Zoom chat, but you don't hit enter immediately. We sort of wait and build up folks' responses, and then when I say, there'll be a little countdown, 3, 2, 1, chat. That's when you all can hit enter, and we sort of watch all of the responses flow up into the chat, and we kind of talk about some of them. So we're going to test one right now, and I'm sure that we've all done variations of this throughout this time in the virtual residency, but I'm curious where in the world you all are Zooming from. So if you want to type that into chat, and don't hit enter yet, but type it and kind of queue it up. Give you just a second to do that. It's probably pretty quick to do this. So I'm going to count down now, and when I say chat, we're all going to hit enter. So 3, 2, 1, chat. Look at all that. There we go. A whole bunch of stuff. A whole bunch of stuff coming up there. That's wonderful. So we have Texas, Missouri, Alabama, Virginia, North Carolina. Yep, as expected, kind of the entire gamut of the United States, and possibly people from beyond as well. So this is wonderful. All right. So we now know how that works. Pretty straightforward and simple. So we'll do that or a variation thereof a few times during this curriculum. All right. So This curriculum, the Cyber Ambassadors curriculum, was developed using best practices in STEM education. And one of those best practices is clearly articulating the learning goals, as well as mapping content and activity to those goals. So let's talk about what those are for this session. The hope is that by the end of this session, you all will have the knowledge and skills to define effective problem solving and effective communication. Identify the characteristics of 3 common types of problems that are encountered. Describe the impact of communication style and list factors that can influence individual styles. Illustrate the use of expectations and observations to invite conversation and to avoid arguments. And then, if there's time, I would certainly be interested in reflecting on the training and to identify areas where you all might think you can apply what we have covered today. So that's the goal. That's what we're going to do today. And here is our formal agenda. We're going to start out by defining what effective problem solving is. We're going to look at several different kinds of problems, including ability problems, motivation problems, and interpersonal problems. And then we're going to talk about and maybe practice some ways to resolve them. So how do we define a problem? Now, this is going to be our first sort of formal chatter. So I want you to think about this for a second. How would you define a problem? I think when you do think about it, you'll find that it's maybe not as straightforward as we think, but I think we can all probably arrive at some various definitions. So let's think about that for a second. How do we define a problem? So think about it and cue it up in the chat. I'll give you a few seconds to do that. All right, so in 3, 2, 1, chatter. Look at all this non-functional systems, something not working as intended, an unplanned event. Expectations not meeting reality. That's interesting. Oh yeah, something that prevents an expected outcome. That's great. Awesome, awesome. Let's see, something where I'm stuck and I cannot make progress. Yep, all of this is wonderful. A pain point or roadblock preventing a task from being able to be completed successfully. All right, this is awesome. I love all of this variety here. A paradigm shift. So that's an interesting perspective on what a problem might be. Very good. All right, well, here is a dictionary definition of a problem, right? And as you saw, there are many different kinds of problems, as you all listed there. But according to at least Google's dictionary, a problem is a matter or situation regarded as unwelcome or harmful and needing to be dealt with and overcome. There also, of course, is the other definition of a problem, such as a math problem or something like that, that sort of needs to be worked with and solved in that way. But I think we're leaning more towards this first one as kind of the types of problems that we're working with here. So, for the purposes of this training, we define a problem as occurring when there is a barrier to reaching our goal. And I think some of you alluded to this in your chatter. So when something gets in the way of making progress or accomplishing something, or when there is a goal, but it cannot be reached until something is overcome or removed or otherwise dealt with. So conversely, how do we define a solution? Well, for the purposes of this training, we're going to define a solution as occurring when that barrier to reaching that goal is somehow removed or overcome. So pretty straightforward. There's something that we want to accomplish, but something gets in the way. We need to figure out a way to address that thing and get it out of the way so that we can get to the goal. Okay. But there's even more to it than that. So a solution is fine, all right, because that's ultimately where we'd like to get to. But how do we define an effective solution? All right. So I'm just curious real quick. Some people throw into the chat what you think might be meant by an effective solution. So this doesn't have to be a formal chatter. You can just go ahead and type it in when you have something to say. I'm just curious. So something that's easy to implement, right? Something that is actionable, right? So yes, it actually has to be achievable. That is for sure. solves problems without creating other problems. Yes, I would imagine that that is definitely part of an effective. Okay, here we go. A result that makes all constituents happy. All right. So we're definitely in the orbit here of where we'd like to be, something where the costs are acceptable compared to the benefit. All right, very good. So for the purposes of this training, we are going to define an effective solution as one that both solves the current problem and maintains the relationships with others involved in the problem-solving process. So let's dive into that a little bit. So solving the problem means removing the barriers, as we talked about, finding a solution, and then implementing it, right? Maintaining relationships means working together, preserving and building connections, and building a strong foundation for success when new problems arise in the future. And critically, it's important to balance both of these goals in order to identify a successful solution. So I'm curious, let's do another one of these little mini chatters sort of. What might happen if the focus is on just solving the problem? So if we don't balance as much the relationship side of things, what do we risk? So when you have some thoughts, put it into chat here. I'm curious. So if we're just talking about solving the problem. So damage to relationship. Well, sure, yeah. If we're talking about the need to balance this, and we are privileging one side of that equation, it certainly might affect those relationships. So yeah, egos get bruised, right? Losing trust and confidence. Okay, all of this is great. This is all correct. Expectations aren't met. The problem might be covered up, right, and not actually addressed, and so it's just going to come back. You might actually create more problems, right? You might not address those underlying causes. Correct. Okay, all of this is good. So when you do focus only on the problem and you ignore the needs of the people trying to solve it, it could lead to things like unhappiness. It can lead to reduced productivity. And in the worst case, it might lead to permanently damaging relationships such that people might leave to work elsewhere. This is the kind of thing where if the goal is only to solve the problem and not necessarily maintain the relationships, it can become somewhat dictatorial, right? Because you as a boss or a supervisor or something like this could just tell someone, do this. This is what you need to do. This is what you're expected to do in order to solve this problem. So I'm telling you to do X in order to do this. And approaching problem solving that way often is not the best way to go about it, because it's probably going to make people not feel heard. It's going to make their opinions not feel mattered and important and whatnot. And so if you're just kind of dictating how to solve a problem, that may very well hurt those relationships. Now, conversely, let's put some ideas in the chat as well. What happens if we shift the focus the other way, where instead of trying to solve the problem really as the main focus, we are mostly concerned with maintaining the relationships? What are the risks there? No progress made towards the solution. Yep, for sure. High cost, the issues end up scaling up, technical debt. Absolutely. Failure to solve the problem results in loss of trust and competence. Yep, absolutely. Very good. Yeah, so this is exactly correct. If we focus primarily or only on the relationships and we ignore the problem-solving process, it might mean that you're actually not getting the work done, right? Like you are truly not making progress towards that solution. And so you might be, so I've seen this in the past. I think probably we all have seen this in the past, where if teams or if a manager or a supervisor or somebody like that preferences the personal relationship dynamics rather than the professional relationships, you may not be able to solve the problems efficiently. So when people become much more concerned with, say, maintaining friendships, because, hey, we all like to be friends with the people that we work with, right? Like that's a good thing. And that can actually lead to increased productivity when there's good rapport and there's kind of an ease about those work relationships. But if we privilege those in an effort to not offend people or not, try to make someone feel that their idea was discarded or whatever, we might not actually be making progress towards solving the problem. So it is important to balance these, and that is the challenge that we all face in these kind of work relationships. All right, so far, we have developed a common understanding of what we mean by an effective problem-solving approach. So now we're going to shift a little bit to an examination of specific types of problems and how to solve them. So we're going to think about a generic scenario here, okay? So we're just going to think about a production line in a factory that makes widgets, okay? But we can actually, since many of us do technical stuff, we can also just think of it generically as we have a system that, people use for their research, and it needs to be faster or whatever. So we can kind of abstract this into something that's a little more concrete, if that makes, we're going to abstract something into a more concrete fashion. Sure. Okay. But nonetheless, we're going to talk about it in terms of like the typical factory making the widgets, but we can all think about it in whatever way might be useful to you. And so let's just assume that we're the manager here at this factory, and we ask members of the night shift, we say, look, you all have to increase production speed so that we can make more widgets, we can make more things, we can make them faster. And so the challenge for you right now is to take a few seconds and think about what are the kinds of problems that might prevent them from doing this. So we want them to make more things, more stuff. We need the system to be able to churn out research faster, like however you want to think about it in your head. And what kinds of problems might prevent whoever is trying to accomplish this from doing this? So we're going to actually do a chatter here. So, take several seconds to consider what are the variety of issues that might be a barrier to that. And cue that up in the chat. All right, 3, 2, 1, go. Wow, look at all that. Lack of funding, insufficient resources. There may not be enough skilled labor, right? People might be unfamiliar with the system. So you're maybe onboarding people and maybe they're not really familiar. There might be morale or stress issues, correct. The quality may suffer, right? So if we're just concerned about speed, the quality may suffer. There might be data management issues. Yes, specifically if we're talking about research systems, that is correct. Staffing, supplies, yeah, all of these kind of things. Very good. Yes, indeed. All right. So let's think about these in terms of categories of problems, all right? So while not all encompassing, most problems can be divided into 3 broad categories: ability problems, motivational problems, and interpersonal problems. So let's dive into a little bit here about each one of these. So ability problems, this is kind of the classic, I can't do this. So why don't you go ahead and type into the chat as you have them some ideas about what might be the source of ability problems. So if someone says, I can't do this, why might that be? So as you have it, just go ahead and put it. So there might be a knowledge gap, correct? Someone may literally not know what to do. They may not have the training, right? So no one has shown them or explained to them how to do it. It might literally be impossible, and that can be for a number of things, right? Physical, technical limitations. They don't have the authority, or they don't feel that they have the authority to make such decisions. Self-confidence, yes, correct. Absolutely. There's no time. Imposter syndrome. That's a great one, right? So yeah, you feel confident that they could do it, but they themselves might feel that they cannot do it. All right, correct. So there might be, as you all have articulated very well, there might be a lack of resources. We don't have enough raw material. We don't have enough disk space. We don't have enough memory. We don't have enough whatever it is to achieve your request. Lack of knowledge, right? Like, well, I don't know. Like, we've never done that before. We don't know how to scale up production. We don't know how to scale up this system, right? Lack of skills. Well, we know how to do it, right? Because there's this lovely documentation, or we know that the people on the first shift can do this, but we ourselves don't necessarily have the skills in order to implement that, right? Lack of experience. So this can be wrapped up in things like imposter syndrome, where, yeah, maybe you've done something once or twice, but you don't really feel confident enough to do it, especially when something pretty important is riding on your success there. So these are all kind of examples of ability problems. All right. Still trying to finish the last three projects you say. Yeah, exactly. Now that's a project management problem. That's not necessarily that's a whole separate discussion for sure. All right, so let's talk about how we might actually solve some ability problems. And to solve these, and I think you're going to see a repeated pattern as we're talking about ways to approach and solve these kinds of issues. One of the first things to do is it's important to work together and understand the situation and identify what needs to be done. So one key way to do that is to ask questions to understand what's really going on. It's often not enough just to say, do this, and then someone says, okay, or no, I can't. It's then important to say, well, tell me more about that. Help me understand what this barrier is. I need to know from your perspective what is going on. So you've got to listen carefully when people are responding to you with the intent to understand rather than to problem solve. And this is an issue that I myself have a lot of challenges with. That, so often we jump to conclusions, or we jump right into problem solving mode rather than really holistically try to listen and kind of see the big picture. We just want to solve it and get it done, right? And we want to move on to the next thing. But doing that causes us often to make assumptions. And we often do just switch right into that problem-solving mode without really understanding the situation or the variety of perspectives before we do that. And then we want to work with the other people or the other person or the team or whatever it may be to figure out the best solution. So instead of just dictating what the best solution is, we need to work collaboratively to figure it out and then arrive at what that is, what we need to do in order to solve the problem. So if we return to the widget factory or the system example or whatever it is that we're thinking in our head, if we identify an ability problem, like if that seems to be what's going on, if that's what the barrier is, we might be able to work collaboratively to resolve it. So perhaps they need additional workers. We literally need more staff to do this. We need more FTE, whatever that might be. We might need new materials. We might need to upgrade our systems. We might need to upgrade the widget machine, whatever it is. If we think about this fantastical machine that just churns out research automatically, right? We need to upgrade that machine. I think we all need that upgrade, right? And so these are all ways that we can approach potentially dealing with ability problems. All right. How about motivational problems? Well, what are we working with here? So this is the classic, I don't want to do this kind of thing. Someone's like, well, that's great and all, but that's just, I just have no desire to do that. So why don't you put into the chat some ideas about what can result in motivational problems? So what might be the root cause of somebody essentially saying, I just don't really want to do that? So something might be perceived as being too complex. They might have a fear of change, right? They might be already overworked. They might be, they might have that long to-do list already. They might be trying to finish those 3 projects that have already been put on. They might not understand the why, right? They might be like, well, why would you ever ask me? Like, I don't want to do that. Like, I don't see the point of that. There might be a lack of incentives, right? Exactly. They might have a past negative experience trying to do something similar. All this is great. They don't believe in doing that. All right. Yeah, perfectly. They're like, well, that's just not the approach that I would take. I don't feel comfortable doing that. Exactly. So as you all have articulated, yeah, they're not vested in it. They don't see the out. They're like, well, I could do that, but what am I going to benefit from doing that? Right. So yes, often motivational problems are caused by a lack of will. The task may be boring, it might be difficult, tedious, repetitive, obnoxious, or as some of you said, just simply uninspired. They may just not care. But regardless, ultimately, the person is not interested in actually doing the work. Now, again, if you think about it from a solutions perspective, you might be able to force someone to do the task. You might say, well, I don't care that you don't want to do it. I'm telling you to do this, right? But if you don't address that underlying motivational issue, you're not going to have an effective solution. So in this case, it often is pretty easy just to solve it. So unlike the first one where, well, hey, if we're going to do this, we need to buy this whole new system, right? Or we need to upgrade or expand or whatever, get more people. But in this case, you often could just cut right to the chase. You could say, well, I don't care that you don't want to do this. You're going to do this, right? But that's going to damage that relationship. And remember, what we want to do here is not only solve the problem, but we want to maintain that relationship. And so it's often not the best idea just to say, well, do it anyway, right? Now, to solve a motivational problem, all right, we really want to understand the situation and identify what needs to be done. So again, I said you're going to see some repetition here. There should be patterns emerging when you think about how to solve these things. We still want to ask questions and we still want to understand what is really going on. And we need to listen to those answers. And we don't want to just jump to the end and say, well, I don't care that you don't want to do it. You need to do it. You need to understand why they don't want to do it. Do they not feel vested? Do they really fundamentally believe that it's going to fail and they're just not interested in going down that path? Like, what is going on? And so unlike ability problems, when there's a motivational problem, you just cannot assume that the other person is interested in collaborating with you to solve it. You have to motivate them to do this. And so you can motivate them by communicating the consequences of not doing this. And so one of the ways is there are two types of consequences, right? There are natural consequences, which are those that happen automatically if the problem is not solved. And there are imposed consequences, which you could put on to somebody in order to provide external motivation. And so, it's important to kind of understand the approach that needs to be taken. So if we are going to return to our widget example, right? How can we motivate our team to increase production? Like, what are some ways possibly that we could solve these kinds of issues? So if you just want to put a couple of things in there. Yeah, positive consequences are a good way, right? Motivational issues are often systemic. Yeah. So there's often a much broader issue that goes beyond you. Yes. So we could do a couple of things in this situation. We could communicate a natural consequence, like explaining to folks that, hey, if you don't increase production numbers, or if we don't churn out more research or whatever, right, we can't fulfill the supplier's requests or the researcher's requests or the NSF's requests or whatever the case may be. Or we could switch to sort of an imposed consequence and saying, well, if we don't do this, we're going to lose out on a bonus for not meeting this quota, right? So there are these couple of ways to do it. All right. And then third, interpersonal problems. This is the classic, you can't make me do this. All right. Now, this one tends to break down into things like personality conflicts, negative experiences in the past, lack of mutual respect, misunderstandings, these kind of things. So there might be conflicts that are rooted in differences in communication or work styles. There could be just sort of a history of distrust between important people who are working on the project. And so let's figure out some ways that we might solve this. So again, right, to solve an interpersonal problem, we want to talk, we want to communicate, we want to understand what is really going on here. We want to listen carefully to those answers with the intent to understand rather than just to problem solve. So you want to acknowledge emotion without judgment. So you want to say things to people like, well, yes, that seems really challenging, instead of coming at them and saying something like, well, you're obviously upset about this. So one is a much more effective approach than the other. And again, we don't want to make assumptions. We don't want to just switch right into that problem-solving mode without understanding what's going on. You need to consider both sides of the situation and what your personal role and responsibility might be in creating the problem as well as solving it. So you may be part of the problem, right? You may be that proverbial part of the problem. And you need to work collaboratively to repair the relationship first before you can often consider ways to solve the problem. So let's go back to the widget factory example. Let's say that, people really seems upset when we're asking them to do this. What might be some initial steps we can take to try to address that kind of thing? So you just put it in the chat when you have a couple of things. Aha, there's not a lot coming through yet. Okay, well, I think the bottom line here with interpersonal problems, right, is that we really can't even get to solving the problem. So this is different than the last one where you could sort of tell someone, well, I don't really care that you don't want to do it, just do it. If there truly is an interpersonal problem here, that often has to be addressed before you can make any progress towards a solution, or you absolutely will assuredly damage that interpersonal relationship, maybe even where it cannot be repaired. Okay. Now, why are these interpersonal problems so challenging to resolve? Well, often they involve strong negative feelings. And a lot of people are uncomfortable having or demonstrating these feelings, particularly in professional contexts. It can certainly make you feel vulnerable to maybe show that you're upset, to maybe cry, to maybe storm out of the room or whatever, because you just get so frustrated and angry. That's often not what we like to see in professional contexts, and it's not what we like to do because it makes us feel weak or vulnerable or embarrassed or whatever it might be, right? So strong feelings can overwhelm us, and when we experience these things, our minds can just shut down, right? We may not be able to communicate effectively in these situations. We may not fully understand or be able to truly listen to what others are saying. We might overlook or confuse facts during the heat of the moment, like during an argument or whatever. And we all absolutely have a natural desire to win those kinds of discussions, right? And that desire to win an argument or whatnot can overwhelm our ability to determine what is the best outcome. And sometimes strong feelings can lead to a fool's choice. And what we mean by this is that we create a dichotomy often that does not exist. So we make a false problem where we're presented with two bad options. So for example, it's like, well, I either have to cheat on this test or I'm going to lose my scholarship, right? I have to steal food or I'm going to go hungry, right? I have to tell a lie or I might lose this friend. But often, I mean, nearly universally, there are alternatives available, some of which might be good options and some of which might be difficult to implement, right? But the point is, we need to think clearly, talk, communicate so that we understand what those actual paths forward are, so that we don't get stuck. So how do we effectively address strong emotions? Well, it can be challenging and uncomfortable to express strong emotions and to address them at the time that they are experienced. And so as a result, right, many people instinctively ignore strong emotions and avoid having the difficult conversations about it. But ignoring these emotions can create interpersonal problems. So the other person might be having a hard time, and if we don't acknowledge that, it may seem like we don't care. So there are some simple steps that we can take to make it easier to address strong emotions. And remember, like with everything, these steps become easier with practice. So we can manage our own emotions. So it's natural to feel heightened and strong emotions in response to another person's distress. But in order to effectively address strong emotions, it's important to remain calm as much as we can. And I struggle with that myself. Trust me, I do. And so you want to practice and model coping behaviors like pausing to take a few deep breaths and acknowledge the other person's feelings without turning it into a judgment. And so to that point, right, we can acknowledge emotion without judgment. We can ask open-ended, neutral questions. These kind of questions acknowledge that the other person seems to be in distress and lets them know that you notice this and that you care. And this gives the other person the opportunity to share if they want. But don't force the conversation. So remember that the underlying challenge may not be a story the other person is able or ready to share at that moment in that space. But if the other person does share, focus on listening and truly trying to understand the situation and provide encouraging feedback. Yes, that sounds hard. I understand that. That must be really challenging for you. But allow them to do most of the talking, right? So focus on the individual and their emotional needs. So your focus in these moments should be on making a connection, right? So this is part of maintaining that relationship, right? So in that balance between solving the problem and maintaining the relationship, this is definitely part of maintaining the relationship. And critically, don't try to solve the problem unless the other person asks for your help or advice. We often want to give advice and help people who seem to be in emotional distress, right? But often that's not what they're looking for, and that may not be helpful in that exact moment. All right. Let's talk a little bit about communication styles. So far, we've developed a common understanding of what we mean by effective problem solving and about different types of problems and solutions. And we've also learned that problem solving isn't easy and problems are complicated and they might involve different classes of issues, right? Or maybe even multiple of those issues. And so communication style is one important aspect of problem solving. And so we're going to look at that next. All right. So why is effective problem solving so hard? Because it is hard, right? It's very hard. And so in order to have an effective solution, we need effective communication between the participants. Communication is most effective when there are strong relationships between the participants or among the participants. And building strong relationships is an investment that requires trust, mutual respect, and a lot of work. So, what makes an effective solution? So remember, we define an effective solution as one that both solves the current problem and maintains the relationship. All right, so communication style matters. It does. The way we communicate, all right, our style. It is an important factor as to whether we are able to communicate effectively. And we all form unconscious biases and opinions about other people based on the ways that they communicate. We are naturally drawn to people with communication styles that are similar to our own, as these types of interactions can be more comfortable and they honestly require less cognitive work for us to sort out. So if you're talking with someone else who has a communication style that resonates with you, it's just easier to kind of have that conversation instead of when someone has very different, because we already understand the rules when our communication styles are well aligned, right? So, common elements. What are some common elements of individual communication styles? Well, accents and dialects can sometimes make it more difficult to understand each other. And we may have unconscious opinions about people with certain accents. So we might, for instance, assume that people with British accents are very highly educated, right? Because it kind of has that sound to some people. While conversely, someone with an American Southern accent, we might assume that maybe they're less educated. Trust me, as someone from Tennessee, I know this very well, right? I have encountered this all in my life. Culture influences how we communicate, for example. So in some cultures, it is rude to speak to someone of the opposite gender or in a different social caste, perhaps. Or maybe it's rude to point with one finger to do emphasis, right? Like we might think that's fairly aggressive sometimes. The pitch, speed, and pacing of someone's communication can influence how it is perceived or received. Someone who talks very quickly with a high-pitched voice might be perceived as overexcited, while someone who speaks slowly or hesitantly might be perceived as less informed or perhaps even ill-prepared. And we each have different tolerance levels for silence in conversation, right? So we may use different social cues to indicate that we'd like to speak or that we'd like the speaker to stop talking. So examples of these social cues range from things that are fairly subtle, such as inhaling or opening your mouth as if to speak, to the more obvious. You might raise a hand, you might move closer or away from a conversation, or you might just simply interrupt the speaker, right? So again, just to emphasize, we tend to like to talk to people with our own communication style, something that resonates. And this is the proverbial challenge, is understanding how to bridge gaps with folks who may have very different styles than our own. I love this quote. This is really great, right? So effective communication can have significant positive impacts on our lives, right? Whereas ineffective communication can have significant negative consequences. And I think what this quote draws out is that a lot of motives are never perceived by the people that we talk to, even though they may be very obvious to us, right? So what we consider, or what someone else may perceive as being rude or stubborn or inconsiderate or a refusal to cooperate, it's really not that. It's often caused by differences in conversational styles. And I think we've all experienced this. You know, email's a classic example, right? Where often the tone and those sort of small social cues often will get lost in the mix. And people think that we're meaning something that we don't, or we may think that somebody is coming across in a way that they're not. Okay, so we are going to talk a little bit about how we can practice this in our kind of daily lives. So we want to communicate expectations and observations, all right? So expectations are what we think, what we wish, or what we assume to be the truth. Observations are facts. What do we know based on actual experience or data? Okay, so there's a bridge there, right? That we often need to talk about how we can overcome that. And so by communicating our expectations, so by talking about what we think, wish, or assume to be the truth, we are telling the other person something about what our natural assumptions are, what our goals or our wishes are. So we could say something like, well, I expected that you would pick up the groceries when I gave you the shopping list this morning so that I could cook dinner tonight. That's an expectation. I expected something to happen and it didn't. But by communicating observations, we're sharing actual facts or experiences. So you could say, I didn't see the groceries in the refrigerator in the pantry when I got home tonight. Well, that's a fact, right? Like that is harder to dispute because the groceries are actually not there. And by communicating our expectations and observations, that tends to provide a relatively neutral foundation for a conversation, and it invites the other person to share their experiences and observations so that we can actually talk about the problem rather than have it devolve maybe into an argument. And so one way to do that is to share expectations first and then observations. So our expectations might be wrong, or we might have different expectations than the other person. So if you start out by saying something like, well, I didn't understand that you needed the groceries before 5 p.m. today so you could cook dinner. I was planning to go shopping after doing my homework, right? So you've expressed what you thought, and they've come back and said, well, I didn't really understand that. My expectation was that I would go shopping after doing my homework. But our observations are true to the best of our knowledge, but we may not have all of the information. So they might have actually bought the groceries already, but they might come back and say, well, I haven't had a chance to unpack the car yet, but I did indeed do the shopping. And the thing that's important about this is that humans naturally have a tendency to remember and respond to the last thing that they heard. Okay, this is why ordering things in a particular way is very critical. All right. And so this is especially true when stress levels are high. All right. So when we are feeling defensive, our natural instinct is to fight back. And when we are feeling defensive, we may not be listening carefully to everything that someone is saying to us, and so we're most likely to lash out and react to the last thing that we hear. And so sharing expectations and observations can be a more natural way to start a conversation. And it's important to remain non-judgmental in our communications. So if we use this expectations then observations formula, but we've already determined somehow in our head that the other person is guilty, right? Then that judgment can come across in our communications. And if the other person feels judged or criticized, right, they are more likely to argue in an effort to defend themselves. And it's fairly easy, right, to argue about expectations, because if that's the last thing that we hear, right, that then is subjective, because expectations are subjective, right? They're not necessarily based on facts, right? We may well be primed to argue. Okay. And we might have different expectations or different understandings of the situations. And we can easily argue about whether the other person's expectations are accurate. So, for example, you could come back and say, well, you didn't specifically tell me to be done shopping by 5 p.m. So I thought it was fine to go after dinner. You just told me to do the shopping today. You just gave me the list. You didn't tell me it had to be done by 5 p.m., right? However, it is harder to argue about observations. So if the last thing that we hear is factual, we are less likely to argue. So, the groceries actually aren't in the fridge or the pantry. So if the last thing we say, so if like we say something like, well, I expected you to do the shopping today, but I don't see that there's anything here. It's easier to come back and say, I actually did do the shopping. They just happened to be in the car. So can you help me go out and get them, right? That leads to a less volatile situation. But what happens if we still disagree? So regardless if you order things in the best way to avoid an argument, what if you still disagree? Well, disagreements are completely normal, right? It's normal for individuals to agree, even when they're communicating effectively, because our ideas, our values, our goals, our expectations, they may conflict. And our opinions about the best approach or the ideal solution may actually differ quite substantially from one another. But individuals who disagree can still work together effectively. They need to respect and trust each other. All right. And often this foundation is established based on areas where they do agree with each other. All right. And considering a variety of ideas, perspectives, and opinions can lead to better solutions. And sometimes disagreements can actually highlight problems or areas for improvement. So what about saying things like, well, we can agree to disagree? Well, sometimes that actually is possible. Sometimes it's, it can be considered a cop-out, right? But actually, sometimes it is very reasonable to do that. So when the area of disagreement is not central to solving the problem, all right, you can often kind of agree to go your separate ways. Just retreat to your neutral corners and we'll just move past this, right? If there is a way to work around the area of disagreement and focus instead on other options, or agreeing to disagree can let you move past that difference and make progress towards a larger goal. So if those are the situations at hand, if you can, say, well, yes, we're going to disagree on this. I don't see that we're able to make progress on this, but honestly, it doesn't really matter when trying to address this specific issue that we're having right now. You can maybe agree to disagree and move on. But this only works if you actually stop trying to convince the other person that you're right. So again, we all have this desire to be right, all right? And it's important not necessarily to do that. But sometimes disagreements are serious issues. So when the area of disagreement is essential to the success of the problem-solving process, then you cannot just easily kind of ignore it and agree to disagree. And so in that situation, some resolution is necessary, whether that is selecting one person's solution and the other person agreeing not to object, even if they disagree with that choice, or bringing in other people or resources to broaden the conversations and identify other options, right? One way to work through disagreement is the ABC method, all right? So as you're working through disagreements, remember the ABCs, all right? A stands for agree. So start by finding the area where you do agree, okay? And then B is for build. So you build the relationship based on this mutual agreement, and you build or enhance the foundation for future discussions based on this mutual agreement that you have. And then C stands for compare. So you respectfully consider both perspectives. You try to understand to the best of your ability why you disagree and where are the fundamental differences in your points of view. And the goal in this situation is not to win the argument or to get your way, but instead to figure out together what viable options are available and whether there is a solution that both of you can accept, even if it's not your first choice. All right, so we're going to talk about some effective communication. This is a little bit of practice here. So this is going to be back to the participatory part of things. So we're going to think about email communication. So what we're going to do here is, for a little bit, I'm going to provide you with some email that describe situations, problems that could use a better way to approach them. And I'm very curious from you in thinking expectations and observations to communicate about problems. So email is great to kind of work through communication examples because email offers us the opportunity to draft, review, and revise, right? It is asynchronous, so it's not necessarily immediate. We have time to think about what we're saying. We can go through one or two or three versions of it before we actually send it. This time spent doing that can be particularly helpful if you are experiencing strong emotions and you need to reflect before you're communicating about a problem. And one tip, and I can tell you this from personal experience that is very useful, is do not fill in the to field of the email before you're actually ready to send the final version, to avoid sending a version of that email which may come across as you being upset, or maybe it's unfinished, you haven't quite finished drafting it, but you accidentally mouse over the send button, right? And there it goes, and you're like, oh my. The undo feature in things like Gmail is very helpful in this case. I always give myself a 5-second undo window for that exact reason. But what you want to do in email, right, is to state your expectations clearly using simple language and straightforward phrasing. So it's important to describe what is expected, including the timeliness, responsible individuals, and the outcomes that are appropriate. State your observations clearly using, again, simple language and straightforward phrasing. Describe what you experienced, when and who was involved as appropriate, and avoid making assumptions about the root source of the problem. Because remember that the goal is to ultimately communicate effectively. So I'm going to show some of these before emails that maybe some of us would have sent, and what I'm very interested in hearing from you all. And in this case, if people want to actually unmute and talk, or if you just want to type something in, we can do that for some of these. We have some time to go through some of these. I'm very interested to identify how we might rephrase these emails to talk instead about expectations and observation, right? And so talk about how we might rephrase these. And it's important to know going into this, there's more than one way to do this. Even when we talk about what an example better would be, it's not the only way to phrase it, right? But I'm just curious if we can get at maybe some things that could be better. So here's an example that maybe some of us have encountered. I know that I have. So we have this email. Dear Jazz, your jobs are going over resource limits and causing the nodes to go down. You need to stop them immediately or we will disable your account. So think about what might be a better way to phrase this in terms of expectations and observations. How might we rephrase some of this? And so feel free, if somebody wants to unmute, we can talk about this a little bit, or if you just want to put in the chat, we can also do it that way. But just think about this for a second. What's a better way to maybe phrase this?
I would probably say there's a limit on the resources we use, and there's a point to which you can use them. We notice that your account is consistently going over, and maybe we'd like to help your team figure out how to work within these limits that we have.
Okay, so making them aware of the fact that this is a limited pool of resource and it's a shared pool. Yes, so give them the benefit of the doubt, right? Absolutely, for sure. The team is excited about your contributions. What can happen to make you more successful, right? Absolutely. Okay, here we go. All right. So yes, here's an example email that has been revised. So dear Jazz, the HPC system limits jobs in order to make the resources available to everyone. We noticed that your jobs are consistently going over these limits, which causes the nodes to go down. Would you please set up an appointment so that we can talk about your resource needs and try to identify a solution? So we have expectations first, right? The HPC system limits jobs in order to make the resources available to everyone. So the expectation is that there's a shared pool of resources here that everyone needs to draw from. And we need to ensure as reasonably as we can that they are available as the majority of users need to use them. The observation, which is based on fact, right? We notice that your jobs are consistently going over these limits. So this some people said, well, I'd give them the benefit of the doubt. And sure, if there's a one-off situation where somebody's jobs go over a limit or whatever, okay, fine. That's accidental. You might just talk to them briefly about it or whatever. But this is someone who's consistently going over these limits. And so you've probably seen it happen 2, 3, 4, 5 times, and now you need to address it. And then what are the consequences, right? So we have our expectations, we have observations, and what happens if we sort of let this go unchecked? Well, it causes the nodes to go down. And so then we want to follow up because we don't just want to leave it at that. Like we just don't want to say, well, so figure out how to deal with that. We want to be part of that solution. We want to maintain the relationship with that researcher. And so we don't just want to say, you're exceeding your resources. That's bad. Stop doing it. Like that's very dictatorial. It's very sort of angry. It's very aggressive, right? And so what we want to say is, hey, let's talk about this. So can we set up a time so that we can discuss your resource needs? Maybe there's a better way to identify a solution. Maybe we can, get you time on national supercomputing resources like Access or whatever the case may be to offload some of the work from the local system. Maybe we can figure out how to write a grant to get more stuff locally so that you can actually do this or whatever. So Anita, yes, I like this. We always ask them to reply ASAP, that they receive the email and understand what they need to do. And if unsure, we offer help. Yes, I think that's exactly what this follow-up gets to, is this notion of, please follow up with me so that I know that you have received this. That is absolutely critical to do. All right, let's see. All right, here's another one. So, dear Dr. Show, from now on, please come to me with all questions and comments instead of the IT staff. I realize that there is a problem on the system that is impacting your work, but my staff is trying their best to fix the problem, and your constant interruptions are distracting them and makes fixing the problem take longer. So again, if we think about it in terms of expectations, observations, and potential solutions, what might we say? And yes, going back, I see that we have some additional comments that, users may have no idea of the problem, right? That is very true. And I think that that's important to call out that we, as say a systems administrator in this case, we have a very holistic view of the system and the resources that are available. And they may not have that kind of insight into the system, or if they do, they may not know really how to leverage it, or that may just not be part of their workflow. They may not even be thinking in that way. And so it's very important to bring it up in a non-confrontational way, things like resource issues, because they may truly be unaware of what the demand is on the system from other users or what the limits of the resources are. And so, yes, the question should be posed to them without being offended. So yes. So, okay. So on this email, what are some things that we can do? And again, feel free just to jump in through chat, or if you want to unmute. I like the unmuting because it makes me feel like I'm not talking to the void.
Okay, I'll
Let's
read what
start
I
by
just wrote then.
Okay.
Dear Dr. Zhou, we noticed you having some consistent issues with the system. I would appreciate if you reach out directly to me with your questions or concerns. My email is X. We appreciate your diligence.
All right. Kyle, I think were you wanting to jump in as well?
I was just gonna say we
Uh-oh.
system, and
There you
then you would follow up by thanking them for letting us know, and that for what your expectations for the customer is next, which is contacting you directly, and then also follow up by saying we'll notify them directly once it's resolved.
All right. Yes. All that is wonderful. So let's look at maybe one possible approach to this. So, dear Dr. Show, the IT department has a ticketing system for our users to submit requests and let us know when there are problems. I understand that you came into this office 3 times last week asking our staff to resolve a problem impacting your work. I rely on the ticketing system to track problems and assign staff to address them. Please make sure to submit a ticket when you have an IT concern. If you do not receive a response within 48 hours, feel free to email me directly. So we've got the expectation, right? Hey, we've got this ticketing system, and it is expected that users will use that because it gives us a way to kind of track these requests so that they aren't just sitting in people's inbox. They might get lost in the shuffle, whatever. If we have a ticketing system, we're expecting people to use them. The observation, which is based on fact, right, is that you come directly into our offices, and not just once. Because again, if it's just kind of a one-off thing, all right, fine, we can handle that, we can resolve that, whatever. But this is multiple times, right? So you came into the office 3 times last week, asking our staff directly to resolve the problem rather than letting it go through the normal chain of kind of workflow. So what's the consequence? Well, the natural consequence is that the person, me in this case, who is responsible for sort of divvying up tasks and ensuring that things get followed up on, if I don't have a ticketing system to kind of do that, then things aren't going to get done efficiently. Things are going to get lost in the shuffle. So that's the natural consequence, that I'm not going to be able to effectively solve the problem and assign staff to the issue unless I know about it through the ticketing system. And so here again, I think that this is a really nice follow-up, because what it does is it still gives the person agency. So it's not just demanding that they use the ticketing system and that's it. It's essentially giving them an SLA. It's giving them a service level agreement. It's saying, hey, please submit a ticket as a first step. Give us a couple of days. We will assign it out. We will get back to you. We will acknowledge the request. If you don't hear from us within a couple of days, let us know. And yeah, I see someone down there notes, is 24 hours too long for a response? Well, that's going to depend upon your sort of institution. It's also going to depend upon the severity of the problem. If the problem is the system is not accepting any new jobs whatsoever, yeah, that is pretty serious, and we need to resolve it pretty immediately. But nonetheless, depending on what the severity of an issue is, you can sort of massage this. Let's see, Anita, we always ask them to submit a ticket rather than directly email. Yes, this is more efficient. Our staff may be out of the office, helps us to track, gets appropriate. Yes, all of this is good. This time we will forward your request to create a ticket. Yeah, that's actually important, because there are some users who might refuse. And we don't necessarily, although, hey, if you all have solutions, because I think we all have those, what I like to sometimes refer to as special snowflakes. We have special snowflakes who, despite being told perhaps multiple times that this is the workflow that we use for X, whatever X may be, they just won't do that. And so maybe as an offshoot of this, I'm very curious how you all might deal with people who are special snowflakes, who might more or less passively or even actively refuse to kind of do the workflow, as it were. So I'm really curious. Andy, do you have something to say? I think you might want to jump in here.
Yeah, I was just wanting to discuss what you've highlighted as natural consequences. To me, this statement seems almost more like an expectation. Like, this is my expectation for how my team functions, not necessarily a natural or imposed consequence. Is this something maybe that should be rewarded to be more properly a consequence of, like, issues that are not, submitted through the ticketing system will not, you know, uh, properly come to my attention, and therefore are, may not be resolved as part of the normal course of our work.
Yes,
Something like that.
that is a wonderful observation. I can say that you're correct. I think in this case that yellow highlighted consequence is more of an implied consequence. I think that the implication there is that if I rely on the ticketing system to track problems and assign people to address them, the implication is that in the absence of a ticket, I'm not going to be able to address it. But I think you're correct. It could probably be articulated a little bit more formally to make that very clear. Yes, indeed. Absolutely. And Henry, yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Okay. All right. Yeah, Henry, I think so. I'd probably express it as 2 business days. Yeah, I mean, each institution is going to have its own wording or its own kind of either explicit or implicit SLA for response times. But yeah, two business days is good, because I think we've all gotten those emails that say, it's like Monday at 8 a.m. and we get an email that says, I emailed you Friday evening at 8 p.m. and I haven't heard back from somebody yet. It's like, yeah, oh, okay, you're right. You haven't heard back from anybody yet. But yeah, so I'm just curious, does anyone have any input as to how you might communicate and address with those special snowflakes who passively or actively resist using solutions like a ticketing system, or who consistently, refuse to use your job scheduler on the cluster and run things on your head node or whatever? I'm always very interested in this. Does anybody have any little anecdotes that they might wish? I invite them to meet with my boss. Play up the benefits to them. Yeah, absolutely. Put the ask right at the top in the form of a question. All right. Henry, do you have an example of that you want to? I mean, you're always amazing with examples. Do you have something to actually? Our special users who don't follow the process get slower service. Okay, there we go. I volunteer submitting the ticket for them. Yes, there are often those individual people who, despite our best efforts, we end up having to do some of this kind of work for them. Yes, can you please use our ticketing system in visiting our systems administrator's office? Yep, there you go. Very good. Last week, 3 of our 4 members were out sick or having family emergencies. This is good, because in a situation like this, right, giving them the consequence that it's likely that we will be able to resolve your situation more quickly if you use the ticketing system, because you run the risk of people being on vacation for a week or 2, or they're out sick, or they have a family emergency, or they're at a conference, or whatever it may be. And so it is, possible that your ticket or your issue, rather, your email will not be seen for many, many, many days. And so, yes, I think that in this particular case, highlighting that benefit of using the ticketing system becomes really critical. I get a lot of compliance from the grad students and postdocs. Yeah, exactly. They are more amenable and more often being told what to do. Yes, unfortunately, that is sometimes true. That students and postdocs and I hate to say junior faculty, because that's not what I mean, but people who maybe aren't quite as along in their careers are often more amenable to coloring with inside the lines, as we might like to say. Reply to them with a human note the minute you see it. Working on it. Yes. We absolutely, that is a best practice, I think. Even if you just acknowledge that the ticket's received, be like, we got it. We will take a look at this and we will get back to you shortly. Absolutely critical. Let's see if there's maybe Okay, so this one's a really interesting interpersonal. This is a very straight and direct way, and that unfortunately I think many of us have dealt with this situation. Dear Allie, I am sick and tired of you interrupting me during meetings. My opinion is just as important as yours. Please stop. What might be a more effective way to address this situation? This is clearly something that was probably sent in the heat of the moment where, people are frustrated, angry, upset, maybe right after coming out of that meeting. What are ways that we can ensure that our perspective is heard and valued?
I would immediately not send this as an email and have a in-person follow-up, because it's just going to get worse from here.
Right, because it's hard to tell the tone from this email. Like, certainly sick and tired seems to indicate a very angry tone, but it could just be more of a resignation, and so, yes, I think having a face-to-face conversation might be a better approach. Going to make a quick stop at HR. Still might be a resume generating event. Oh, my. Oh, my.
I have tolerance for in the heat of the moment discussions, but when you take the time to sit down and think through an email and still hit go baby go on something like this, that means there's deeper underlying issues. You're not being successful on the team. You're not feeling engaged. I want to provide you the opportunity to excel somewhere else.
I think you hit on an important thing, and that is that indeed something like this, if a situation gets to this point, it probably means that there are absolutely underlying issues going on. So one way to maybe rewrite this, if you are going to write something back, is, again, we want to lay out the expectations. So the expectation is that the ground rules for our weekly meetings include making sure that everyone has a chance to contribute to the conversation. And yes, this does require that whoever is organizing the meetings or leading the meetings, like I see Michelle there wrote, who is running these meetings? Yes, it requires somebody to kind of help referee that maybe and ensure that everyone does have a chance to contribute effectively. But then the fact is that I noticed that you interrupted me twice at a meeting this morning. So again, we've given them the benefit of the doubt. One time someone jumps in, maybe it's perceived as interrupting, but when it starts to happen 2-3 times, or if it happens over a consistent number of meetings, that can be problematic. Which meant, here's the consequence, that I wasn't able to fully explain my idea for the project. So then the follow-up is, I'd like to present my idea at our next meeting. Would you please include 10 minutes for me in the agenda? And I love that, because that indicates that the person doing the interrupting is actually in charge of the agenda. So I mean, it could be right that they are interrupting because they feel that the agenda is getting behind schedule and that they need to move on, right? And so I think we've probably all had conversations like that where we would like the dialogue to continue for longer than what there actually is time for. So it's important maybe to propose that and to say, look, can I really have the time that I need to articulate my thoughts? Okay, so we only have, let's see, it is also possible to communicate, yes, this goes right back to what we were saying, that the communication styles are different. And in many cultures, it is appropriate to interrupt and not considered rude. Unfortunately, that is the case sometimes. This goes back to really trying to understand those communication styles, and do a good job of trying to bridge those gaps where possible. So what I'm curious here in our last few minutes, I hope that this has been useful. And what I would love to hear from you is maybe, ways in which you either like what is a good takeaway from this for you, and how might you use some of the things we've talked about in your professional lives? It's been super useful. I'm glad to hear that. Getting a couple thumbs up on that. The NVC, so what is the NVC model? I'm not familiar with that. Feel free to unmute if you want, Laura.
Nonviolent communication.
Nonviolent communication, okay.
I think you actually do, yeah, what the person, Andrew, what he just put, that's actually kind of what it suggests. expectations, facts, and then what you would want. So the request at the end, like you have.
Right. Make the ask. Like it's not just enough to kind of,
Yeah.
say like there has to be an ask, or there has to be a, well, okay, how can we move forward? Like, this is what yeah,
Yeah.
very good. Love the examples and walkthroughs. Yep, absolutely. Big fan of nonviolent communication. Thanks for sharing that resource. All right. Well, this has been really wonderful. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to give this talk. I certainly appreciate it. Thank you, Dirk. Thank you, Henry. Thank you to all the participants who are here. I will stop sharing the screen. And I will end it with that, maybe just a few seconds early. Thanks, Anita. You're very welcome. Thank you, everyone.
All right, let me turn off the recording.